Hey there, welcome to Mr. Cozy True Crime Stories. Tonight, we're diving into 2 hours of gripping true crime cases. Real stories of mystery, betrayal, and cold-blooded crimes, all set against the soothing backdrop of rain. It's the perfect blend of calm and unsettling. If these cases draw you in, tap that like button, share with your fellow true crime lovers, and subscribe to join our curious community. I'm always wondering, where are you tuning in from? And what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. Now settle in, and let's dig into the darkness. Story 1. The summer evening of August 6th, 2013, settled over Simpson, Pennsylvania, with the kind of warmth that made people linger on their porches and keep their windows open to catch any hint of breeze. In a modest home on a quiet street, 44-year-old Melissa Marie Rockuba and her husband Bruno returned from an evening out with friends. From the outside, their lives appeared settled and ordinary. A couple married for 25 years, parents to 2 grown daughters who had families of their own, residents of a tight-knit community where neighbors knew each other's routines and looked out for one another. Melissa had spent her younger years as a police officer, a job that required strength, courage, and the ability to read dangerous situations. At 19, she had met Bruno, who was 3 years older and serving in the Navy. They fell in love, married, and built a life that from the outside looked like everything Melissa's younger sister Joan had ever wanted for herself. Melissa loved being a wife and a mother, pouring herself into raising their daughters Chelsea and Sabrina with devotion and warmth. She was the kind of mother who made her children feel safe, who celebrated their milestones, and who later doted on her grandson Greg with fierce love. But inside the walls of the Rockuba home, there were tensions that only family members glimpsed. As the daughters grew older and moved into adulthood, they began to see cracks in their parents' marriage that had not been visible when they were children. Arguments became more frequent, voices grew louder, and there were moments when the conflict turned physical. Sabrina, the older daughter, recalled moving in with her parents temporarily with her own child, only to witness disturbing fights fueled by alcohol. One night, she saw her father grab her mother by the hair and slam her into a wall so hard that Melissa could not breathe. Sabrina knew then that she could not stay in that house, but when she tried to talk to her mother about it, Melissa downplayed the violence, unwilling to speak badly of Bruno to her children. 2 weeks before the night that would change everything, Melissa took Chelsea for a drive and shared a secret she had kept hidden. She told her younger daughter that Bruno had once pulled a gun on her when she refused to be intimate with him. It was a revelation that shocked Chelsea, who had always seen her father as someone who loved and protected them. Why was her mother telling her this now, after years of silence? Melissa's words carried a weight that Chelsea could not fully understand at the time, but they would later take on a terrible significance. "Your dad's not always who you think he is," Melissa had said, and those words hung in the air like a warning. On the evening of August 6th, Melissa and Bruno went out to dinner with another couple, Jack and Tonia Wilksuski. The 4 of them had been friends for some time, sharing meals and conversation in the way that couples in small communities often do. That night, according to Jack, everything seemed normal. There was no arguing, no obvious tension, just the usual rhythm of friends enjoying each other's company. But as the evening wound down and Melissa and Bruno prepared to leave, something shifted. The ride home, captured later on the couple's home security system, told a different story. The security camera mounted on the front of the Rockuba house recorded video and audio as Melissa and Bruno pulled into the driveway shortly before 10 o'clock. The footage captured the sound of an argument beginning in the car. Bruno's voice could be heard telling Melissa that next time she could get her own ride, his tone sharp with anger. Melissa responded, and the tension between them was palpable. As they moved inside the house and out of the camera's view, the argument continued. With the bedroom window open to the summer air, the microphone picked up muffled sounds of voices raised in conflict, curses exchanged, and accusations hurled. For nearly 30 minutes, the argument escalated. Melissa could be heard saying she had not done anything wrong. She told Bruno he had to leave, referencing something he had done hundreds of times before. The words were hard to make out in places, but the anger and frustration in both voices was unmistakable. Then there were sounds of objects being thrown, of movement and struggle. And then, cutting through the noise, came the sharp crack of a gunshot. The sound echoed through the house and into the night. Moments later, Chelsea Ciccio, who lived in the house next door with her young son Greg, received a frantic phone call from her father. There had been a terrible accident, he said. Her mother had been hurt. Chelsea ran from her house, her movements captured on the same security camera that had recorded her parents' arrival home. Her voice, raw with panic, could be heard screaming, "Mommy, Mommy," as she entered the house and saw what no daughter should ever have to see. Melissa was lying on the bed, a bullet wound to her head. Blood covered the floor and the side of the bed, pooling in a way that made it clear this was a catastrophic injury. Bruno was there too, clutching his left hand, which was also bleeding. He told Chelsea that he had been cleaning his gun when Melissa sat down on the bed, and it had accidentally gone off. One bullet, he said, had passed through his hand and struck Melissa in the head. It was a freak accident, he insisted, a terrible twist of fate that had injured them both. Emergency services arrived quickly. Melissa was airlifted to a trauma center, still clinging to life, while Bruno was taken to a different hospital for surgery on his hand. The bullet had left a hole straight through his palm, an injury that seemed to support his story of an accident. Family members rushed to be by Melissa's side. Her sister Joanne and their father, a police sergeant in another county, drove through the night to reach the hospital. Sabrina flew in from Wisconsin, praying the entire way that her mother would survive. Chelsea, still in shock, tried to process what she had seen and what her father had told her. Bruno's injury became a focal point for everyone around him. Who would shoot themselves through the hand? People asked. The injury seemed to prove that Bruno could not have deliberately harmed Melissa, because no one would willingly put a bullet through their own body. Family members felt horrible for Bruno, sympathizing with him as the husband who had accidentally shot his wife of 25 years. He seemed devastated, and in those first hours and days, no one wanted to believe that anything more sinister had occurred. Less than 15 hours after the shooting, with Melissa still on life support and Bruno's hand freshly bandaged, Pennsylvania State Police detectives asked Bruno to walk them through his house and explain what had happened. The scene was still marked by violence, the mattress stained with Melissa's blood, the floor splattered with evidence of trauma. Bruno sat on that blood-stained mattress and used a toy gun provided by police to demonstrate how the shooting had occurred. He explained that he had kept his loaded .40 caliber pistol in the nightstand because there had been recent break-ins in the neighborhood. That night, he said, he wanted to put the gun away safely because their grandson was coming to visit the next day. He had reached over to check if there was a round in the chamber, and that was when Melissa sat down on the bed. She leaned back toward him, and somehow the gun went off, shooting through his hand and into her head. Detectives asked if there had been any arguments or disagreements that night. Bruno said no, that everything had been fine between them. He told them they had come home holding hands, that there had been no tension at all. His story was straightforward and delivered with apparent sincerity. The next day, he agreed to take a polygraph test, though the results came back inconclusive. Worried that her father might face legal trouble, Chelsea suggested he hire an attorney. Bruno reached out to Joe Dandria, a well-known criminal defense lawyer in the area, but Dandria found that he had little work to do. The Lackawanna County District Attorney's Office reviewed the case and concluded that they did not have enough evidence to charge Bruno Roccubo with murder. Without clear proof of intent, they decided not to file any charges at all. Bruno was free to go home, free to mourn, and free to move forward with his life. Melissa remained in intensive care for 3 days, her brain too damaged to recover. Her family stood by her bedside, holding on to hope even as doctors gently explained that there was nothing more they could do. On August 10, 2013, at 1:45 in the morning, Melissa's family made the agonizing decision to take her off life support. She passed away quietly, surrounded by people who loved her. Her death certificate listed the cause of death as a gunshot wound to the head, but the manner of death was left pending, a bureaucratic acknowledgement that questions remained unanswered. In the days that followed, Bruno's behavior began to trouble those closest to Melissa. While she had been dying in the hospital, Bruno had spent very little time at her bedside. He would come for an hour, then leave, as if he could not bear to be there. When Melissa died, he was not at the hospital, he was at home. Chelsea and Sabrina, grieving and in shock, found themselves focused on comforting their father, who seemed so broken by what had happened. But then Bruno began asking his daughters to do things that struck them as strange. While Melissa was still on life support, he asked them to clean the house and get rid of the blood-stained mattress. He said he could not bear to come home to the sight of all that blood, and Chelsea, only 22 years old and desperate to help her father, agreed. She and her sister hauled the mattress into the back of a truck and burned it in the woods, destroying a piece of evidence that might have told investigators more about what had happened that night. Even before Melissa was buried, Bruno asked his daughters to help him get rid of her belongings. He wanted everything gone, he said. Her clothes, her personal items, the photographs that hung on the walls, all of it had to be removed. It's like he wanted her erased, Chelsea would later say. Melissa's sister Joanne was horrified when she realized that Bruno had donated all of Melissa's clothes to a thrift store, and she had to go there herself to find something suitable for her sister to be buried in. Bruno even got rid of Melissa's beloved Rottweiler, Zeus, a dog that Melissa had adored for 10 years. Within months, every trace of Melissa's presence in the house had been scrubbed away. Then there was the matter of Tonia Wilczewski. Not long after Melissa's death, Bruno began dating Tonia, the wife of his friend Jack, who had been with them the night of the shooting. Jack started noticing changes almost immediately. The day after Melissa was shot, Jack walked into Melissa's hospital room and found Bruno and Tonia in what looked like an embrace. They claimed they were just talking, but Jack was not convinced. In the weeks that followed, Jack would come home from work to find Bruno's car in his driveway. When he asked why Bruno was visiting so often, Tonia made him feel as though he was imagining things. Then one night, Jack woke at 2 a.m. to find Tonia gone. He drove to Bruno's house and honked the horn. Tonia came walking out with barely any clothes on, got in her car, drove back to their home, packed her belongings, and moved in with Bruno. Chelsea, still living next door to her father, watched as Tonia took over her mother's life. Tonia cut her hair to look like Melissa's. She got her nails done the way Melissa used to. She sat in Melissa's chair on the front porch and cooked in Melissa's kitchen. That first Christmas after Melissa's death, Chelsea looked out her window and saw Tonia preparing Christmas dinner in what had been her mother's home. She had not been invited. The sight was painful and surreal, but Chelsea tried to accept it because she did not want her father to be alone. Joanne and others in the family began to suspect that Bruno and Tonia had been having an affair before Melissa's death. Bruno had asked Melissa's best friend how long he should wait before publicly dating someone, a question that seemed shockingly inappropriate so soon after his wife's death. The friend had been stunned, unable to believe he was serious. Tonia later sent a text message to a reporter denying that there had been an affair, but the timing and circumstances left many people unconvinced. About 1.5 years after Melissa's death, Chelsea finally confronted her father directly about what had happened that night. His answer shattered any remaining doubts she had been holding on to. "I didn't mean to kill her," Bruno said. "I just tried to scare her." The words hung in the air for a moment before he turned and walked out of the room, carrying groceries from the car, as if he had not just confessed to pointing a gun at his wife with intent. Chelsea knew then that her father had held a gun to her mother on purpose, and she could never look at him the same way again. Chelsea spent months agonizing over what to do with this information. When she finally told her father that she was going to report their conversation to the police, Bruno threatened her. He said that if she went to the authorities, he would ruin her credibility, and no one would believe her. Despite his threats, Chelsea went to the state police barracks and filed a report. She told them about her father's confession and about the incident her mother had shared before her death. when Bruno had threatened Melissa with a gun for refusing to be intimate with him. But the investigator she spoke with suggested that her coming forward might be motivated by money, and nothing came of her report. Chelsea was told it was her word against her father's, and the case remained closed. What Chelsea did not know at the time was that Bruno had manipulated both her and her sister into signing away their rights to their mother's estate. Melissa had left behind a will and over $300,000, meant to be divided among her husband and daughters. Bruno sent paperwork to his daughters asking them to sign documents giving him complete control of the money. Sabrina signed without reading the papers, trusting her father even as he manipulated her into feeling guilty. Chelsea, still in shock from her mother's death, signed as well, not fully understanding what she was giving up. Bruno took the money that was supposed to go to his daughters and his grandson, adding financial betrayal to the emotional devastation he had already caused. For years, it seemed as though Bruno Rakuba had gotten away with murder. The case remained officially open, but no charges had been filed and life moved on. Chelsea tried to let go of her anger for the sake of her son Greg, who adored his grandfather. She hated Bruno for taking her mother from her, but she loved the way he treated her boy. It was complicated and painful, a tangle of emotions that could not be easily resolved. Then in 2020, 7 years after Melissa's death, Pennsylvania State Police investigators Corporal Greg Allen and Corporal Dan Nyland were assigned to review open homicide cases. The Rakuba case caught Allen's attention immediately. What stood out to him was the original 911 call. On that call, when the operator asked if Melissa's injury was self-inflicted, Bruno had said, "No, we were fighting." Then he quickly changed his story, saying they had been playing around with the gun, and that it had gone off accidentally. A few moments later, he changed his story again, saying they were planning to go shooting, and he had let it go off. 3 different accounts in a single phone call seemed like more than just confusion or panic. It was a series of red flags that demanded closer examination. Allen and Nyland reviewed the videotape of Bruno's walkthrough with detectives the day after the shooting. They watched him sit on the blood-stained mattress and demonstrate how the gun had supposedly gone off. But as they studied his account, they noticed problems. Bruno said he had been checking the chamber to see if there was a round in the gun, but any experienced gun owner knows that the first step in clearing a weapon is to drop the magazine. Bruno had not done that. The gun also had 2 safeties, including a grip safety and a trigger safety, both of which had to be engaged for the weapon to fire. It was not the kind of gun that went off accidentally. Bruno had demonstrated pointing the gun to the left side of the bed, away from where he was sitting. But the blood spatter and ballistics evidence were on the wall behind Bruno, not on the opposite side. The physical evidence did not match his story, and Allen and Nyland knew they needed to dig deeper. Then Nyland made a discovery that would change everything. He found that a home security system had been in place at the Rakuba house, and that the DVR had recorded video and audio from the night of the shooting. The original investigators had noted the existence of the recording, but had not had the technology to review it properly. Nyland did. He sat in the police office with the door closed and headphones on, the refrigerator unplugged to eliminate background noise, listening to the final moments of Melissa Rakuba's life. What he heard confirmed their suspicions. The recording captured Melissa and Bruno arriving home from their night out, arguing in the driveway. Bruno's voice was harsh, telling Melissa to get her own ride next time. Once inside the house, the argument continued, picked up by the open bedroom window. For nearly 30 minutes, the couple could be heard cursing at each other, calling each other names, their voices rising in anger. Melissa shouted that she had not done anything wrong. She told Bruno he had to leave. The sounds of objects being thrown could be heard, and then, unmistakably, a gunshot. The investigators sent the audio to the FBI crime lab for enhancement. When the enhanced version came back, it was even clearer. The couple had been fighting right up until the moment the gun went off. This was not an accident. This was a violent confrontation that had ended in death. The recording also captured something else. Chelsea's voice, screaming for her mother after Bruno called her over, and Bruno's response when she asked him why it had happened. On the tape, Bruno told Chelsea that Melissa had wanted to take the gun out and play, implying that his wife had been the one holding the weapon. It was yet another version of his story, and it contradicted everything he had told the police. Forensic expert Dr. Wayne Ross was brought in to analyze the blood spatter evidence. His conclusion was damning. The pattern of blood on the wall behind Bruno indicated that he had been standing over Melissa, likely in the middle of the bed, facing the headboard. Melissa had been lying on the bed, and Bruno had been holding her down with his hand while threatening her with the gun. There had been a struggle, and during that struggle, the gun went off, the bullet passing through Bruno's hand and striking Melissa in the head. It was not an accident. It was murder. On June 3, 2022, nearly 9 years after Melissa's death, Bruno Roccuba was arrested. Pennsylvania State Police troopers followed him on his way to work and pulled him over in a traffic stop. They asked if he had any guns on him, then ordered him to put his hands behind his back. Bruno was charged with murder and with theft, for the money prosecutors said he had taken from his daughters. He immediately asked for his lawyer. The case moved slowly through the legal system. As Bruno's trial approached in May 2024, his defense attorney Joe Dandria knew he faced significant challenges. The enhanced audio of Melissa's final moments was devastating. The changing stories Bruno had told were all on tape. The evidence of the argument directly contradicted Bruno's claims that they had been getting along fine, and the forensic analysis of the blood spatter left little doubt about what had really happened in that bedroom. Dandria focused his defense on the injury to Bruno's hand, arguing that no one would deliberately shoot themselves through the palm to kill someone else. But as the trial date neared, both sides agreed to a plea deal. Bruno Roccuba pleaded guilty to third-degree murder, acknowledging that his actions had been reckless and had caused Melissa's death, though stopping short of admitting that he had intended to kill her. The theft charge was dropped. On January 8, 2025, Bruno was sentenced to 12 to 40 years in prison. With time already served, he would be eligible for parole beginning in 2035. At the sentencing hearing, Joanne stood and read a victim impact statement, looking Bruno in the eye and making him see her, knowing that her resemblance to her sister must have felt like seeing a ghost. She told him that he had never shown an ounce of remorse. She spoke about what he had done to his daughters, killing their mother, and then trying to erase her existence. She promised that every time he came up for parole, she would be there to protest it. Chelsea and Sabrina were left with complicated feelings. They had gotten justice for their mother, but they had also lost their father. Chelsea's son Greg had lost his grandfather, the man who had been so good to him, and that loss was hard for a young boy to understand. Chelsea struggled with the knowledge that in seeking justice for her mother, she had caused pain for her son. Then in March 2025, just weeks after the sentencing, tragedy struck the family again. Chelsea's son Greg, only 13 years old, was riding his all-terrain vehicle when he collided with an SUV and was killed. The family that had already endured so much loss now faced another devastating blow. Joanne, reflecting on everything that had happened, said it felt like something out of a book or a television show, not something that should be their real life. Melissa Marie Roccuba's story is one of a woman who tried to hold her family together, who downplayed the violence she endured, and who finally, in the last weeks of her life, began to speak the truth about the man she had been married to for 25 years. It is a story about how easily someone can hide behind a plausible explanation and a self-inflicted injury, and how long it can take for the truth to emerge when the evidence is overlooked or dismissed. It is also a story about the power of a voice captured on a recording, speaking from beyond the grave, ensuring that justice could finally be served even when the person who could testify was no longer alive to do so. Story 2. The morning of November 10th, 2025, began like countless other mornings in the quiet neighborhood on New Oak Lane in Huntersville, North Carolina. The houses sat tucked among mature trees in a comfortable suburb just north of Charlotte, where families raised children and couples settled into the rhythms of middle age. Inside one of these homes, 54-year-old Susan Michelle Perry and her 58-year-old husband Robert Joe Perry were about to have a confrontation that would end in death. The couple had been married for years, sharing a life that from the outside appeared stable and ordinary. Joe worked, Susan managed their home, and they existed in the kind of comfortable routine that defines many long marriages. But beneath that surface normalcy, something had been fracturing for some time, tensions building in ways that Susan may not have fully recognized until it was too late to change course. Joe Perry had reached a decision. He wanted a divorce. The marriage wasn't working anymore, and he had decided it was time to end it. On the evening of November 9th, 2025, Joe told Susan what he had been thinking, what he had decided. He wanted out of their marriage. He wanted to start over, to build a life that didn't include her anymore. For Susan, this news must have felt like the ground opening beneath her feet. She was 54 years old, with no independent income, no career of her own, financially dependent on the man who was now telling her he was leaving. The argument that night was heated, voices raised in the way that happens when people realize their lives are about to change in ways they can't control. The next morning, November 10th, the argument resumed. Joe and Susan stood in the hallway of their home, continuing the fight that had started the night before. The words were angry, desperate, each person trying to make the other understand their position, their pain, their needs. And then Joe turned and walked into his home office, perhaps seeking space, perhaps trying to end the conversation. Susan followed him. Inside the office, the argument escalated further. And then Joe grabbed a gun. Shortly before 1 o'clock in the afternoon on November 10th, 2025, the Huntersville Police Department received a 911 call from the Perry residence on New Oak Lane. The call was logged as a suicide attempt. Susan Michelle Perry was on the line, reporting that something terrible had happened to her husband. When officers from the Huntersville Police Department arrived at the home, they found a scene that appeared to support Susan's initial report. In Joe Perry's home office, the 58-year-old man lay on his back on the floor, a gunshot wound to the center of his chest. Susan was kneeling on the ground near him, and a gun rested on a nearby table. First responders immediately began life-saving measures, working desperately to save Joe's life. But the wound was too severe, the damage too extensive. Despite their efforts, Robert Joe Perry was pronounced dead. Susan told the responding officers what had happened, or at least what she claimed had happened. She said she had heard a thud, like the sound of someone falling. When she went into Joe's office to check on him, she found him lying on his side with blood spreading around him. Panicked, she had called 911 immediately. The story Susan told was consistent with suicide. A man alone in his office, a gunshot, his wife discovering him after hearing the sound of his fall. It was tragic but not uncommon, especially for middle-aged men facing life transitions or crises. The initial assessment classified Joe's death as a suicide attempt that had succeeded. But experienced homicide investigators know that initial impressions can be deceiving, and that the stories people tell in the immediate aftermath of a death aren't always the complete truth. The Huntersville Police Department began a thorough investigation into Joe Perry's death, and what they discovered would completely change the narrative Susan had presented. As part of their standard investigation into Joe's death, detectives obtained Susan Michelle Perry's cell phone and downloaded its contents. What they found there immediately raised suspicions about Susan's account of her husband's suicide. Susan's internet search history told a very different story than the one she had given police. In the days or weeks before Joe's death, Susan had been conducting Google searches that suggested she was thinking about what would happen if her husband died, and how much she might benefit financially. The search history showed that Susan had looked up how much her husband's wedding ring was worth, a question that seems innocuous on its surface, but takes on a darker meaning when viewed in the context of his subsequent death. She had also searched for information about what to do if your husband wants a divorce and you have no money. This search directly connected to the argument Susan would later admit she and Joe had been having about his desire to end their marriage. But the most damning search in Susan's history was one that seemed impossible to explain away as innocent curiosity or coincidence. Susan had Googled the term center mass shots. In firearms training and tactical instruction, center mass refers to aiming for the center of a person's torso, specifically the chest area where vital organs are located. It's the target area taught to law enforcement and military personnel because a shot to center mass is most likely to immediately incapacitate or kill a target. Joe Perry had been shot once in the center of his chest, exactly where a center mass shot would strike. The placement of the wound aligned perfectly with what Susan had been researching on her phone. These searches painted a picture that directly contradicted Susan's story of walking into Joe's office and finding him after he had shot himself. Instead, they suggested premeditation, planning, research into how to kill someone, and what financial resources might be available afterward. Based on the evidence they had gathered from Susan's phone and their continuing investigation into the circumstances of Joe's death, detectives from the Huntersville Police Department asked Susan to come to the police station for a second interview on February 6, 2026, nearly 3 months after her husband's death. During this interview, Susan's story changed dramatically. She no longer maintained that she had simply found Joe after he shot himself. Instead, she told investigators a new version of events, one that acknowledged her presence in the room when the gun went off but still portrayed her as a victim rather than a perpetrator. Susan told detectives that she and Joe had argued on the night of November 9th because he had told her he wanted a divorce. The next morning, November 10th, the argument had resumed in their hallway, and then Susan had followed Joe into his home office. According to Susan's new account, Joe had grabbed a gun while they were in the office. However, she said he held it normally and wasn't pointing it at her or at himself. Susan claimed that she became scared that Joe might fire the weapon, so she grabbed it, and the two of them started struggling over the gun. Susan said that while she was still holding the gun during this struggle, it went off, and Joe was struck in the chest. She was now admitting that she had been holding the gun when it discharged, that her finger had been on the trigger when the shot that killed her husband was fired. But even this new version of events was riddled with inconsistencies and contradictions. Detectives noted that Susan made several statements that didn't align with each other or with the physical evidence. She gave conflicting accounts about how long she had waited before calling 911 after Joe was shot, changing the timeline in ways that suggested she was trying to construct a narrative rather than simply recounting what had actually happened. Susan also provided inconsistent information about whether she had tried to administer first aid to Joe after he was shot. In some versions of her story, she had attempted to help him. In others, she hadn't. And her explanation of where she had put the gun after Joe was shot also varied, depending on when and how she was asked. The medical examiner's report provided crucial information that helped investigators understand what had really happened in Joe Perry's office on November 10, 2025. The autopsy determined that Joe had been shot at close range, with the gun positioned near his body when it was fired. This finding was significant because it aligned with the physical positioning that would have existed during Susan's claimed struggle over the gun. If Joe and Susan had indeed been fighting over the weapon, and it had discharged while Susan was holding it, the close-range nature of the wound would be consistent with that scenario. However, the close-range finding also aligned with another possibility, that Susan had intentionally shot Joe at close range, perhaps while he was unarmed and unprepared to defend himself. The medical evidence alone couldn't definitively prove which scenario had occurred. What the medical evidence could definitively prove was that Joe Perry had been shot in the center of his chest, in what firearms experts would recognize as a center mass shot, the same type of shot that Susan had been researching on her phone before her husband's death. The precision of the wound placement, combined with Susan's internet searches, suggested knowledge and preparation rather than the panic and chaos of a struggle. On February 6, 2026, after Susan's second interview with detectives, the Huntersville Police Department made the decision to arrest her. Nearly 3 months after Robert Joe Perry's death, his wife was charged with first-degree murder. The arrest warrant and accompanying affidavit laid out the evidence against Susan Michelle Perry in stark detail. The document described how Susan had initially claimed to have found Joe after he shot himself, then changed her story months later to claim they had struggled over the gun. It outlined the inconsistencies in her various statements to police. And most damning of all, it detailed the internet searches on Susan's phone that showed she had been researching her husband's financial worth, her options if he divorced her while she had no money, and how to shoot someone in the center mass. Susan Michelle Perry was booked into the Mecklenburg County Jail, where she was held on a bond of $150,000. As part of her conditions of detention, the court ordered that Susan undergo a mental health assessment. Her next court hearing was scheduled for February 27, 2026. As Susan Michelle Perry sits in the Mecklenburg County Jail awaiting her next court appearance, many questions about what happened on November 10, 2025, remain unanswered. What exactly transpired in Joe Perry's home office that morning? Was it truly a struggle over a gun that accidentally discharged, as Susan now claims? Or was it a deliberate, planned shooting by a woman who had been researching how to kill her husband and what she would do after he was gone? The prosecution will likely argue that Susan's internet searches show clear premeditation. They will point to her research about center mass shots and argue that the precise placement of the wound in Joe's chest proves Susan knew exactly where to aim. They will highlight her searches about what to do if her husband wanted a divorce and she had no money, suggesting a financial motive for murder. And they will emphasize the inconsistencies in Susan's various statements to police, arguing that an innocent person's story doesn't change dramatically over time. The defense will likely argue that Susan was a frightened woman whose husband grabbed a gun during an argument, forcing her to defend herself. They may claim that her internet searches were innocent expressions of worry about her financial future if Joe divorced her, not evidence of murder planning. And they will argue that Susan's changing statements to police reflect the trauma and confusion of having been involved in her husband's death, not consciousness of guilt. The medical evidence showing that Joe was shot at close range could support either interpretation. If Susan and Joe were struggling over the gun, they would have been close together when it fired. But if Susan walked up to Joe and shot him deliberately, he would also have been at close range. The key question for a jury will be whether they believe Susan's story of a struggle that ended in an accidental shooting, or whether they believe the prosecution's theory that Susan researched how to kill her husband, waited for the right moment during an argument, and deliberately shot him in the chest when he told her he wanted a divorce. Robert Joe Perry was 58 years old when he died. He had lived more than half a century, built a career, married, made a home on New Oak Lane in Huntsville. He had reached a point in his life where he wanted something different, wanted to start over, wanted the freedom that comes with ending a marriage that no longer works. He told his wife he wanted a divorce on November 9, 2025. Less than 24 hours later, he was dead from a gunshot wound to the chest. Whether his death was the accidental result of a struggle over a gun or the intentional act of a wife who didn't want to face divorce remains to be determined by the criminal justice system. Susan Michelle Perry, 54 years old when arrested, now faces first-degree murder charges that could result in decades in prison if she is convicted. She has not yet entered a plea, and her attorney has not publicly commented on the case. It remains unclear whether Susan will ultimately claim self-defense, argue that the shooting was accidental, or maintain some other version of events. What is clear is that the internet searches on Susan's phone have become the most significant evidence in the case against her. In the digital age, the searches we conduct on our phones and computers leave permanent records of our thoughts, our plans, our fears, and sometimes our intentions. Susan Michelle Perry searched for information about center mass shots, about her husband's financial worth, about what to do if he wanted a divorce and she had no money. Those searches, combined with Joe Perry's death from a single shot to the center of his chest during an argument about divorce, have led prosecutors to charge her with his murder. As February 27, 2026, approaches and Susan Perry prepares for her next court appearance, the community of Huntsville watches and waits to see how this case will unfold. A man is dead, a woman is charged with his murder, and the truth of what happened in that home office on New Oak Lane remains contested, known perhaps only to Susan herself. The case of Susan Michelle Perry stands as a stark reminder that domestic arguments can escalate in terrible ways, that the decision to end a marriage can sometimes trigger violence, and that in the digital age, our online searches may ultimately tell a story about us that we never intended to reveal. Story 3. The morning sun rose over Bushbuckridge in March 2012, casting long shadows across the small South African community where people knew one another's names and troubles. Among them was a young police constable named Nomia Rosemary Ndlovu, a woman who wore her uniform with apparent pride and carried herself with the authority that came with serving the law. But beneath that facade of duty and protection, something far darker was taking shape. A calculated plan that would transform her into one of South Africa's most chilling serial killers. Rosemary, born in 1978, had entered the funeral insurance business in 2006, years before she would turn that knowledge into a deadly enterprise. By 2012, as a young constable stationed in Bushbuckridge, she had begun securing multiple life and funeral insurance policies, carefully selecting her targets from the very people who should have trusted her most, her own family. The first name on her list was her cousin, witness Madalahomu. In the paperwork, she had audaciously listed him as her husband, a fabrication that would allow her to claim benefits when the unthinkable happened. In March 2012, witness Madalahomu was found dead, his body bearing the brutal evidence of severe head injuries. To those who knew him, his death seemed like a tragic accident or perhaps a violent robbery gone wrong. But Rosemary knew better. She had orchestrated every detail, employing a hitman to carry out the murder while she maintained her distance, crafting an alibi that would keep suspicion at bay. When the insurance payout arrived, Rosemary collected it with steady hands, her grief performance convincing enough to deflect questions. It was the beginning of a pattern that would repeat itself with horrifying regularity over the next 6 years. The money came easily, and with it came an insatiable hunger for more. Rosemary's next target was someone even closer to her heart, her own sister, Audrey Samisa Ndlovu. In June 2013, Rosemary set her plan in motion with the same cold precision that had characterized Witness's murder. She had taken out policies on Audrey's life, ensuring that she would be the beneficiary when tragedy struck. On June 29, 2013, Rosemary approached a neighbor named Johanna Fudimweep, introducing herself with tears already beginning to well in her eyes. She had been seen leaving Audrey's residence on 2 separate occasions that day, movements that would later become crucial pieces of evidence. The following morning, Rosemary returned to Ms. Mweep, her face contorted with distress, begging her neighbor to accompany her to Audrey's home. At first, Ms. Mweep refused, sensing something amiss, but Rosemary began crying with such apparent anguish that the neighbor's resolve crumbled. As they walked toward Audrey's cottage in the Batimo residence complex, Rosemary pulled out her cell phone and began dialing, speaking in hushed tones in her indigenous language. Ms. Mweep warned her not to make that call, an instinct she couldn't quite explain, but would remember vividly in the months to come. When they reached the main entrance to the residence, Rosemary suddenly collapsed to the ground, her cries piercing the quiet morning air and attracting nearby residents, including another woman named Masarani Salamina Massengane. Together, Ms. Mweep and Ms. Massengane approached Audrey's cottage, their hearts pounding with growing dread. The security door was locked, but when they tried the wooden door behind it, it swung open. Inside, they found Audrey Samisa Ndlovu's lifeless body. She had been poisoned and then strangled, her life extinguished in a brutal attack. The scene was staged, with cups sitting conspicuously in the room, evidence that Rosemary immediately tried to remove, only to be warned against it by the witnesses present. Thomas, who had been Audrey's partner, arrived at the scene and would later testify to a chilling moment. A man whom Rosemary had introduced as her own partner pulled him aside and asked why he had strangled Audrey, a bizarre accusation that seemed designed to deflect suspicion. But investigators would later piece together a critical fact. Rosemary had been the last person seen leaving the cottage before Audrey's death. Her dramatic display of grief, her convenient discovery of the body, and her attempt to tamper with evidence all pointed to a woman who was not just present at the scene, but instrumental in orchestrating the murder. The deaths continued with ruthless efficiency. That same month, June 2013, another cousin named Zanil Moto was beaten to death, her body discovered with injuries that spoke of a violent end. Then, in a particularly cruel twist, Rosemary turned her attention to her boyfriend, Maurice Hingwain Mabesa, the father of her child. Their relationship had been stormy from the beginning, marked by constant fighting and violence so severe that their landlord, Percival Malyalik, testified they had nearly burned down his property during one of their altercations. Morris's brother, Justice Mabesa, would later describe the relationship as tumultuous, requiring constant intervention to keep the peace. Despite never being married, Rosemary and Maurice shared a child, a bond that should have protected him, but instead made him another target in her deadly scheme. When Maurice disappeared, Rosemary was once again the first to raise the alarm, arriving at the trauma section with tears streaming down her face. A nurse named Tinswalo Malyalik noticed something peculiar about Rosemary's grief. It seemed to come in waves, intense one moment and then suddenly composed the next. Rosemary even denied that she had been the one to call herself to report Morris's death, a detail that seemed insignificant at the time, but would later contribute to the mounting evidence against her. By April 2017, Rosemary's list of victims had grown to include another cousin, William Mashaba, found murdered under circumstances that bore the same hallmarks of careful planning and violent execution. Each death brought another insurance payout, and Rosemary's bank account swelled with blood money totaling approximately 1.4 million rand, roughly $93,000 at the time of her arrest. In January 2018, tragedy struck once more when Rosemary's nephew, Brilliant Makigo, suddenly vanished. Days later, his body was discovered, and investigators began examining cell phone records with renewed scrutiny. The data painted a damning picture. Brilliant's phone had last been active when he was with Rosemary, and her own records showed they had spent most of the previous day together, driving from Johannesburg to Bushbuckridge. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Rosemary was always present, always the first to discover the bodies, always the beneficiary of the insurance policies. But Rosemary's ambition had grown beyond her capacity for caution. She began plotting yet another murder, this time targeting her own sister Gladys and Gladys's 5 children. She planned to have them all burned alive in their home, a horrific scenario that would have brought her another substantial insurance payout. To carry out this massacre, she contacted a man she believed she could trust to do the job. His name was Njabulo Kanena, and he would become the instrument of her downfall. Njabulo listened to Rosemary's plans with growing horror. Instead of agreeing to commit mass murder, he made a decision that would save lives and bring justice to the families who had lost so much. He went to the police, specifically to an officer at Tembisa South Police Station named Nthambolo. The revelation sent shockwaves through the police management, and a plan began to take shape. A sting operation that would catch Rosemary in the act of plotting murder. Sergeant Keshi Benneth Mabunda of SAP's Oliphants-Fontein was assigned to lead the investigation. He was a detective known for his meticulous attention to detail and unwavering commitment to justice, qualities he would need in abundance as he began piecing together the evidence against one of his own colleagues. The investigation was fraught with challenges from the start. Mabunda received death threats, warning him to back away from the case. He was also battling a terminal illness, his body weakening even as his resolve strengthened. But he refused to be deterred, driven by a sense of duty that transcended his personal suffering. Working closely with Njabulo, the police developed an elaborate plan. They instructed Njabulo to maintain contact with Rosemary, to continue discussing the details of the planned murders while secretly recording their conversations. During one crucial phone call, police officers gathered around as Njabulo put the call on speaker, allowing them to hear Rosemary's voice detailing her murderous intentions. The trap was set, and Rosemary walked directly into it. On March 7, 2018, in the early morning hours, Rosemary checked herself into Carsonhoff Medical Facility, a strategic move designed to establish an alibi for the murders she believed were about to take place. Shortly after, Jabulo and an undercover police officer arrived to pick her up, explaining that they needed her to show them the exact location where the killings should occur. Rosemary agreed without hesitation, settling into the passenger seat as they began the 5-hour drive from Johannesburg to Bushbuckridge. What Rosemary didn't know was that hidden cameras were recording everything. As they drove through the South African countryside, she spoke freely, outlining her plans with chilling clarity. She explained where her sister lived, how she wanted the family murdered, and why she needed the insurance money. She even suggested they be burned alive to make the deaths look like an accident. The video footage captured in that car would become one of the most damning pieces of evidence against her, a permanent record of her cold-blooded intentions. When they arrived in Bushbuckridge, Rosemary pointed out her sister's home, providing specific details about how to access the property and execute the attack. She believed she was orchestrating another perfect crime, one that would bring her financial gain while she remained safely distanced with an unshakable alibi. Instead, she had just sealed her own fate. At the taxi rank in Bushbuckridge, Sergeant Becky Zulu stepped forward and placed Rosemary under arrest. Her rights were explained to her as the reality of her situation began to sink in. The police convoy drove back to Gauteng, stopping at Rosemary's home in Tembisa, where officers conducted a thorough search of the premises. Inside, they discovered a treasure trove of evidence, numerous insurance policy documents, each one representing a life that had been taken or targeted for Rosemary's financial gain. Rosemary was remanded in custody for over 2 years before her trial commenced in July 2021. During this time, authorities uncovered even more disturbing evidence of her criminal intentions. While incarcerated at Johannesburg Correctional Center, Rosemary had somehow obtained illegal access to a cell phone, and she used it to orchestrate yet another murder plot. This time, her targets were the very people responsible for bringing her to justice. Her former commander, Colonel Mthype Baloka, and Sergeant Keshi Mabunda, the investigating officer who had built the case against her. She allegedly paid a hitman to kill both men, but the scheme was discovered, and additional charges were filed against her in October 2018. She was subsequently transferred to Kosi Mampuru Correctional Center in Pretoria, where security was tighter and her ability to communicate was restricted. When the trial finally began, it immediately took on a dramatic character. Rosemary entered a plea of not guilty to all charges except one, and her behavior in court was described as disruptive, reminiscent of a circus performance. She embarked on theatrical displays of emotion, attempting to portray herself as a victim of circumstance rather than a calculating killer. Throughout the proceedings, which lasted 3 months, she maintained her innocence and accused the 50 state witnesses of lying about her involvement in the murders. But the evidence against her was overwhelming. The prosecution methodically laid out how Rosemary had systematically arranged life and funeral insurance policies for her relatives, then orchestrated their deaths to collect the payouts. Cell phone records placed her at or near each crime scene at the critical times. Handwriting experts testified that documents had been filled out by Rosemary herself, forging relationships and beneficiary designations to maximize her claims. The hitmen she had contracted came forward, testifying about the promises of payment she had made and the specific instructions she had provided for each murder. Some witnesses were too terrified to testify. Gladys, the cousin whose family had been targeted in the final, failed murder plot, chose to disappear rather than face Rosemary in court. The fear was understandable. This was a woman who had proven herself capable of killing anyone, including those closest to her, without apparent remorse. Perhaps most heartbreaking was the testimony of Rosemary's own mother, Maria Mushawana, who took the stand in her daughter's defense. A mother's love is a powerful force, and Maria could not reconcile the image of her child with the portrait of a cold-blooded serial killer being painted by the prosecution. She struggled to believe that the daughter she had raised could be capable of such monstrous acts. What Maria didn't know, or perhaps couldn't accept, was that she herself had been a target. Rosemary had attempted to have her own mother murdered, a plot that had thankfully been thwarted before it could be carried out. On October 22, 2021, Judge Ramaramo Monama delivered the verdict that would bring closure to years of pain and uncertainty. Nomia Rosemary Ndlovu was found guilty on all major charges: 6 counts of murder for counts of fraud, 7 counts of incitement to commit murder, and the attempted murder of her mother. The courtroom was silent as the judge read through each conviction, the weight of Rosemary's crimes settling over everyone present. 2 weeks later, on November 5, 2021, Judge Monama returned to pronounce sentence. The courtroom was packed with journalists, family members of the victims, and members of the public who had followed the case with morbid fascination. The judge's words were measured but firm. Rosemary would receive life imprisonment for each of the 6 murders she had committed. In addition, she was sentenced to an additional 125 years for the 16 other charges, including 10 years for each count of incitement to commit murder, 10 years for each fraud count, 5 years for defeating the ends of justice, and 10 years for attempting to murder her own mother. The sentences would run concurrently in some cases, but the message was clear: Nomia Rosemary Ndlovu would never walk free again. Lieutenant General Elias Mwela, the SAPS Gauteng Provincial Commissioner, welcomed the verdict, stating that it demonstrated the police service's commitment to rooting out officials who betrayed their oath to serve and protect. He specifically commended Sergeant Keshi Benneth Mabunda for his relentless pursuit of justice despite facing death threats and battling terminal illness. Mabunda would later be awarded the Detective of the Year accolade at the SAPS National Excellence Awards, recognition for his courage in investigating a colleague without fear or favor. For the families of Rosemary's victims, witness Madala Homu, Audrey Samisa Ndlovu, Maurice Hingwain Mabesa, Zanil Moda, William Mashaba, and Brilliant Makigo, the verdict brought a measure of justice, though it could never restore what had been taken from them. These were people who had trusted Rosemary, who had loved her as family, and who had never suspected that the woman in the police uniform was plotting their deaths for financial gain. In total, Rosemary had collected approximately 1.4 million rand from insurance companies, money stained with the blood of 6 innocent people. The case sent shockwaves through South Africa, gripping the nation's attention and raising troubling questions about how someone sworn to uphold the law could become its most egregious violator. Criminologists classified Rosemary as a serial killer, noting the methodical nature of her crimes and her complete lack of remorse. The story of Nomia Rosemary Ndlovu stands as a chilling reminder that evil can wear a familiar face, that trust can be weaponized, and that the pursuit of money can corrupt the human soul to unimaginable depths. She had transformed her family members into financial instruments, viewing them not as people with hopes and dreams, but as paychecks waiting to be cashed. In the end, justice prevailed, but only because one man, Njabulo Kunena, chose to speak up rather than participate in murder, and because one detective, Sergeant Keshi Mabunda, refused to let personal hardship prevent him from seeking the truth. Behind the bars of Kosi Mampuru Correctional Center in Pretoria, Rosemary Ndlovu now spends her days with the weight of 6 life sentences, a living monument to greed and betrayal. The woman who once walked the streets of Bushbuckridge in a police uniform, trusted and respected by her community, had become something far different. A serial killer whose name would be remembered alongside the darkest chapters of South African criminal history. And while her victims can never be brought back, their families can take some solace in knowing that the woman who stole so much from them will never have the opportunity to harm another soul. Story 4. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the elegant campus of Paris Dauphine University on September 20th, 2024. Inside the student canteen, 19-year-old Philippine finished her lunch, gathering her belongings as she prepared to make the familiar journey home to her parents' house in Yvelines, a quiet suburb west of Paris. She had no way of knowing that within hours, she would become the center of a tragedy that would shake France to its core and ignite fierce debates about justice, safety, and the failures of a system meant to protect its citizens. Philippine was the kind of young woman who seemed to radiate promise. Born on October 10, 2004 in Clamart, she came from a respected Catholic family with roots stretching back to 17th century French nobility. But Philippine was no distant aristocrat living in privilege alone. Her mother taught mathematics. Her father worked as a physicist for the French Alternative Energies and Atomic Energy Commission, and Philippine herself had chosen to study economics and financial engineering. She was one of 6 children in a close-knit family, devoted to her faith and her community, serving as a scout leader with the Scouts and Guides of France, a role she had embraced since childhood. Every Sunday, she attended Mass at the Church of Saint Pierre du Lac in Montigny-le-Bretonneux, where her family lived. By 2024, Philippine had moved into her own apartment on Boulevard Lons in Paris's affluent 16th arrondissement, a stone's throw from her university. She made the journey home regularly, maintaining those precious family connections that meant everything to her. That Friday afternoon should have been just another routine trip home. The last confirmed sighting placed her at the university around 2 o'clock in the afternoon. After that, Philippine Lenoir de Carlin simply vanished. When she did not arrive at her parents' home as expected, her family tried to reach her. Their calls went unanswered. Their messages remained unread. As the hours ticked by and darkness settled over Paris, concern turned to alarm. Around 11 o'clock that evening, a relative walked into the police station in the 16th arrondissement to report Philippine missing. Following standard procedure, officers opened an investigation into an urgent disappearance. Philippine's loved ones refused to wait passively. They attempted to geolocate her mobile phone and discovered that the signal was coming from somewhere in the Bois de Boulogne, an enormous park on the western edge of Paris that sprawls across more than 2,000 acres. Once a royal hunting ground, the Bois de Boulogne had become a place of contradictions in modern times, a beautiful green space by day that harbored darker activities after sunset, known for prostitution, drug use, and occasional violence. A close friend of Philippine contacted founder of a mobile app designed specifically to help women in danger. The founder activated an alarm and circulated a missing person notice through the app's network. Within hours, the alert reached an estimated 300,000 people directly, and with shares across social media, nearly 1 million people became aware that Philippine was missing. The next afternoon, September 21st, approximately 50 people mobilized to search the Bois de Boulogne. They combed through the trees and undergrowth, calling her name, hoping against hope for a simple explanation. The volunteers spread out across the park, their eyes scanning the ground, alert for any sign. Then someone found Philippine's cell phone lying in the dirt. 20 meters away, searchers noticed something wrong with the earth, irregular shapes that did not belong in the natural landscape. They moved closer, their hearts pounding, and there, partially buried in a shallow grave, they discovered what they had feared most. Philippine was dead. Police immediately secured the area. Scientific experts and investigators descended on the scene, meticulously collecting evidence, photographing everything, searching for any clue that might reveal who had done this. Medical examiners later determined that Philippine had died from asphyxiation, though there were no signs of strangulation. The conclusion was chilling. She had been suffocated, her life stolen in those woods where she should have been safe. The news spread rapidly. Paris Dauphine University gathered to observe a minute of silence on September 23rd, the campus community united in grief and shock. On September 27th, nearly 1,800 people filled the Versailles Cathedral for Philippine's funeral, with another 1,000 standing outside on the Parvis, unable to fit inside. Abbot Pierre-Hervé Grosjean led the service for a young woman whose future had been violently erased. But even as mourners gathered to remember Philippine, investigators were working with extraordinary speed and skill to find her killer. What followed was described by judicial sources as a masterpiece of investigation. Without any genetic fingerprints at the crime scene to guide them, the criminal brigade turned to other methods. They analyzed thousands of pieces of telephone traffic data from the Bois de Boulogne district and from Saint-Denis, cross-referencing locations and times. One crucial lead emerged. Someone had used Philippines' bank card to withdraw cash from an ATM in Montreal. Investigators obtained video surveillance footage from the bank. Frame by frame, they studied the images until they identified a suspect. The man was 22 years old, a Moroccan national. On September 24th, just 3 days after Philippines' body was discovered, police arrested him at the Genève-Cornavin railway station in Geneva, Switzerland. The arrest brought relief that the suspect was in custody, but it also revealed a story that would horrify France and raise uncomfortable questions about failures in the justice system. The suspect's history painted a disturbing picture of a violent man whom the system had released back onto the streets despite clear warnings about his danger to society. Born in 2002 in Oujda, Morocco, he had entered France in June 2019 at age 17 on a tourist visa, arriving via Spain. Shortly after his arrival, French Child Welfare Services in Val d'Oise took him into care. Just 3 months later, in September 2019, he raped a 23-year-old student in Taverny. Police identified him through DNA evidence, arrested him, and placed him in pretrial detention. On October 5, 2021, the Val d'Oise Juvenile Assize Court convicted him and sentenced him to 7 years in prison for rape, a reduced sentence because he had been a minor when he committed the crime. He served his time from 2019 until June 2024, when he was released at the end of his sentence. But his release should have marked the beginning of his removal from France, not a return to freedom on French soil. On June 18, 2024, the same day he left prison, authorities notified him of an obligation to leave French territory, along with a 10-year ban on returning. The French administration requested a consular pass from Morocco that would allow his deportation. Upon release, he was placed in an administrative detention center in Metz while authorities worked to secure the necessary documents. His detention was extended 3 times as officials waited for Morocco to issue the required travel documents. But on September 3, 2024, a judge of liberties in detention ordered his release from the detention center. French law limited how long someone could be held in administrative detention while awaiting deportation, and despite recognizing the man's dangerousness, the judge determined that the legal threshold for continued detention had been reached. Before releasing him, authorities notified him of house arrest at a hotel in Nyon, with strict requirements that he regularly check in with officials to ensure he did not evade surveillance. Just 2 weeks later, on September 19, 2024, he failed to report as required. Authorities entered him into the file of persons wanted by prefectural services. The next day, September 20th, 2024, he murdered Philippine. The investigation revealed that he had also assaulted her before killing her. An investigating judge was assigned to handle the case, with charges including murder preceded and followed by other crimes, rape, theft, and fraud, all committed while in a state of legal recidivism. But capturing the suspect was only the beginning of another complex process. Because Switzerland is not a member of the European Union, France could not simply use a European arrest warrant. Instead, they had to follow formal extradition procedures governed by the European Convention on Extradition and a 2003 agreement between France and Switzerland. France submitted its extradition request on October 9, 2024. During a hearing before a Geneva prosecutor on October 16th, the suspect refused the simplified extradition procedure, which could have meant months of legal wrangling. But on November 6th, Swiss authorities handed him over to French officials in Annemasse, on the France-Switzerland border. The murder of Philippine unleashed a firestorm of political debate across France. But beneath these expressions of grief and solidarity, deeper arguments raged. How had a convicted rapist under deportation orders been free to kill again? Why had the consular pass from Morocco arrived on September 4th, the day after his release from detention, just days too late? Should the judge who ordered his release bear responsibility, or was the judge simply following laws that made continued detention impossible? Were the Moroccan authorities at fault for delays in processing the travel documents, or had French bureaucracy caused unnecessary delays? Interior Minister, who had taken office just days before Philippines' murder, seized on the case to push for tougher immigration policies. He summoned prefects and unveiled plans to increase deportations of people subject to removal orders. He proposed extending the maximum period of administrative detention to 210 days for serious crimes committed by irregular migrants. Far-right politicians used Philippines' death to argue that immigration posed an existential threat to French society. The debates grew heated and divisive. Some accused politicians of exploiting Philippines' death for political gain. Others insisted that citizens had a right to demand answers about why a dangerous criminal had been released to kill again. For Philippines' family, the political arguments could never bring back their daughter, their sister, their beloved Philippine. She had been 19 years old, with her entire life ahead of her. She had been studying, serving her community, attending church, maintaining close ties with the family she loved. She had done everything right. She had been walking home in broad daylight in one of Paris's most prestigious neighborhoods. And she had been murdered by someone whom the justice system knew was dangerous, someone who should never have been free on French streets. As France continued to grapple with the implications of Philippines' death, one truth remained inescapable. A young woman with a brilliant future had been stolen from the world, her promise extinguished in the woods of Bois de Boulogne, leaving behind a family shattered by grief and a nation forced to confront uncomfortable questions about the systems meant to keep its people safe. Story 5. The city of Hammond, Indiana, sits flush against the sprawling metropolis of Chicago, a place of industry and smokestacks, of hard-working families and quiet, tree-lined streets. It is a city defined by its proximity to the Great Lake and the Great City, a place where the rhythm of life is steady and unassuming. On Gosselin Street, in a neighborhood of modest, well-kept homes, stood the small brick house that was the entire world for Dorothy and William Zaney. For more than 50 years, this house had been their sanctuary, a fortress of memory built brick by brick, year by year. By May of 2006, Dorothy was 85 and William was 91. Their lives had slowed to a gentle, predictable rhythm, governed by the rising and setting of the sun and the small, cherished rituals of a lifetime together. William, once a strong steelworker, was now confined to a wheelchair, his world having shrunk to the familiar dimensions of their home. Dorothy was his caregiver, his companion, his anchor. She was a woman of formidable spirit, her 85 years having etched lines of laughter and determination onto her face, but they had not dimmed the bright, fierce love she held for her family. Her greatest joy, outside of her husband and the sprawling family that orbited them, was her garden. The small patch of earth behind their house was her canvas. In the spring and summer, it was a riot of color, a testament to her patient, nurturing hands. It was a place of life, of growth, a place where she could feel the sun on her back and the soil under her fingernails. It was her sanctuary within the sanctuary of her home. No one could have imagined that this place of peace would become the setting for an act of violence so brutal, so senseless, that it would leave a permanent scar on the heart of the community and a question that would haunt a family for years to come. The evening of May 23, 2006, began like any other in the Zaney household. The familiar smells of dinner cooking on the stove filled the small house, a comforting aroma that spoke of routine and care. Dorothy was in the kitchen, preparing a meal for herself and the husband she had tended to for so long. William was in his wheelchair in another room, the television casting a flickering blue light into the gathering dusk. It was a scene of domestic tranquility, a portrait of enduring love in the twilight of life. Sometime that evening, a sound from the backyard broke the quiet rhythm of the house. It was a noise out of place, a disruption to the familiar soundtrack of their lives. For Dorothy, a woman fiercely protective of her home. A sound from the outside was something to be investigated. Perhaps it was an animal in her beloved garden. Perhaps it was a neighborhood kid cutting through the yard. She likely turned from the stove, wiping her hands on her apron. "I'll be right back," she might have said to William, her voice carrying the easy confidence of a woman in command of her own small kingdom. She opened the back door and stepped out into the cool spring air, into the sanctuary of her garden. She never came back. Inside, William waited. The minutes stretched into an unknowable length of time. The familiar, comforting smell of dinner began to change. It grew sharp, acrid. A thin tendril of smoke curled from the kitchen, then another. The pot on the stove, forgotten in the sudden rush to investigate the noise, was beginning to burn. The smoke thickened, filling the small house, a choking, gray fog that stung the eyes and caught in the throat. For William, trapped in his wheelchair, a new kind of terror began to set in. The house was filling with smoke, and his wife, his Dorothy, had not returned. He was helpless, a prisoner in his own home, as the smoke alarm began to shriek its shrill, insistent warning into the night. It was the alarm that saved him. A neighbor, hearing the piercing cry, rushed over. They found the house thick with smoke, an elderly man in a wheelchair calling out in confusion and fear, and a pot of food blackened and burning on the stove. The immediate crisis was averted. The pot was taken off the heat, the windows thrown open to the night air. But one question hung in the smoky haze. Where was Dorothy? The search was short, and its conclusion horrific. There, in the backyard, amidst the budding flowers and the turned earth of her garden, lay Dorothy Zaney. She had been brutally, savagely attacked. The cause of death was later determined to be blunt force trauma to the head, a massive skull fracture that had ended her life in a storm of unimaginable violence. She had been bludgeoned to death in the one place on earth where she should have been safest. The Hammond police arrived to a scene of profound and baffling tragedy. The sheer brutality of the crime was shocking. An 85-year-old woman, murdered in her own backyard. But the circumstances were deeply perplexing. Nothing of value appeared to have been taken from the house. There were no signs of a forced entry, and her 91-year-old, wheelchair-bound husband had been left completely unharmed. Robbery did not seem to be the motive. This was not a crime of opportunity. This was an act of pure, unadulterated violence, an explosion of rage directed at a defenseless elderly woman. Who would do such a thing? And why? The community was stunned. Dorothy was a beloved figure, a matriarch not just of her own family, but of the neighborhood. She was the kind of woman who watched out for the local children, who always had a kind word for a neighbor. The idea that such a violent end could meet such a gentle life was something the mind struggled to comprehend. "We can't get our heads around this," her granddaughter, Angela Patterson, told the Chicago Tribune. "There's no one that would want to do this to her." The family was plunged into a nightmare of grief and confusion. They remembered Dorothy as the vibrant, loving heart of their world. They remembered the Sunday dinners, the holidays, the simple, everyday moments of a life lived with generosity and grace. Now all they had were memories and the horrifying image of her final moments. They were left to grapple with a loss that was made all the more unbearable by its senselessness. As the Hammond police dug into the investigation, they found themselves at a dead end. There were no witnesses to the attack, no forensic evidence that pointed to a suspect. The weapon was never found. The crime seemed to have been committed by a ghost, a phantom who had emerged from the darkness to commit a terrible act and then vanished without a trace. But as investigators looked beyond the borders of their own quiet city, a chilling and terrifying possibility began to emerge. Dorothy Zaney's murder was not an isolated event. It was the latest in a string of brutal, seemingly random bludgeoning attacks that had been terrorizing the greater Chicagoland area for the past year. A pattern was beginning to take shape, a pattern of violence so specific and so savage that it pointed to the terrifying possibility of a serial killer, a hammer murderer, stalking the most vulnerable residents of the city and its suburbs. The wave of terror had begun almost a year earlier, in June 2005. Peter D'Agostino, a 48-year-old college professor, a small, bookish man, was walking home from work in broad daylight when a man in a car pulled up beside him. Without a word, the man got out, attacked D'Agostino with a sledgehammer, and drove away, leaving him to die on the sidewalk. The attack was witnessed, and a composite sketch of the killer was created, but he was never identified. For months, there was a lull. And then, in the spring of 2006, the violence erupted again with terrifying frequency. On April 3rd, Anna Mae Davis, a 59-year-old woman, was found bludgeoned to death in her Chicago home. 3 weeks later, on April 26th, a 14-year-old girl walking to school was attacked from behind by a man with a hammer. Miraculously, she survived, and her description of her attacker bore a chilling resemblance to the composite sketch from the D'Agostino murder. The very next day, on April 27th, 74-year-old Evelina Blame was found murdered in her home, less than 5 blocks from where Anna Mae Davis had been killed. She too had been bludgeoned to death. And then, less than a month later, Dorothy Zaney was killed in her garden in Hammond. The method was the same. The victim profile was the same. Someone who was elderly, small, or otherwise physically vulnerable, someone who could not fight back. The lack of a clear motive in each case was the same. The geography was the same, a tight cluster of attacks in Chicago and its immediate cross-border suburb. For law enforcement, it was a terrifying puzzle. Were the cases connected? The similarities were too stark to ignore. But publicly, police departments were hesitant to link the crimes, perhaps for fear of creating a public panic. They were dealing with a predator who seemed to strike at random, a shadow man, who moved through the city with a hammer and a heart full of rage, choosing his victims based on their perceived weakness. The connection, however tentative, cast Dorothy's murder in an even more terrifying light. She was not the victim of a random burglar she had startled. She was, it seemed, the latest victim of a serial killer, a woman whose only crime was to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, to be seen as an easy target by a predator who was hunting the helpless. But even with this broader context, the investigation into Dorothy's murder stalled. The trail went cold. The hammer murderer, if indeed it was a single person, seemed to vanish as suddenly as he had appeared. The string of brutal attacks stopped. The headlines faded. The city moved on. But for the Zaney family, there was no moving on. There was only the gaping hole where their matriarch had been, and the gnawing, unanswered question of who had taken her from them and why. Years passed. William Zaney lived out his final days without his beloved Dorothy, the trauma of her death a constant companion. The garden behind the house on Gosselin Street became overgrown, its colors fading, a silent, poignant memorial to the woman who had once tended it with such love. The case of Dorothy Zaney became another file in the cold case archives, a story of unsolved violence. But the calls never came. The crucial piece of information that would break the case open never materialized. The killer remained a phantom, his identity, his motives, his story, all lost to the silence of the past. The murder of Dorothy Zaney is a story without an ending. It is a testament to the brutal fact that sometimes there is no justice. Sometimes the guilty are not caught. Sometimes the question of why is never answered. It is a story about the fragility of peace, about the way violence can erupt in the most unexpected of places, shattering the quiet lives of good people. It is the story of a beloved grandmother, a caregiver, a gardener, who stepped out into her own backyard on a spring evening and met a monster. Her killer did not just take her life. He stole a family's sense of safety, their belief in a just and orderly world. He replaced it with a permanent, aching void, a wound that time can never fully heal. Today, more than a decade and a half later, the case remains open. Dorothy Zaney is not forgotten. Her name is a whisper in the archives of unsolved crimes, a face on a cold case website, a memory cherished by a family who still waits for an answer that may never come. And in a quiet neighborhood in Hammond, Indiana, a small brick house stands as a silent monument to a life of love and a death of unspeakable and unsolved brutality. Story 6. In the humid embrace of a Memphis autumn in 1974, the city pulsed with the raw energy of the South. honky-tonk bars spilling jazz into the night, the Mississippi River churning secrets as it flowed lazily past the bluffs, and young lives teetering on the edge of hope and despair. Charles Howard Wallace was 19, a lanky young man with a quiet demeanor that masked the storms brewing inside him. Born and raised in the heart of Tennessee, Charles had grown up in a modest home where the air always carried the faint scent of fried okra and the distant hum of freight trains. His family wasn't wealthy, but they were close-knit, the kind that gathered around a worn kitchen table for Sunday suppers, sharing stories that wove the fabric of their days. His mother, Evelyn, a seamstress with calloused hands from years at the sewing machine, doted on her son with a fierce, unspoken love. She remembered him as the boy who fixed broken toys for his younger siblings, his dark eyes thoughtful even then. But by the fall of 1974, Charles's world had begun to fracture. He had fallen into the grip of addiction, a shadow that crept in during his late teens, pulling him away from the familiar streets of his neighborhood. The doctors called it substance abuse, but to Evelyn, it was a thief stealing her boy piece by piece. Seeking a way out, Charles entered a halfway house in downtown Memphis, a squat brick building on Beale Street's fringe, where the neon lights flickered like false promises. The house was a place of second chances, filled with men like him, haunted by their choices, clinging to the routines of group therapy and curfews. Charles arrived there with a small duffel bag containing little more than a change of clothes and a worn Bible his father had given him. "Hold on to this," his father, Howard, had said, his voice gravelly from years in the steel mill. "It'll guide you home." The last time Evelyn heard her son's voice was over a crackling phone line in late October. "I'm doing better, Mama," Charles told her, his words laced with the exhaustion of someone fighting invisible battles. He spoke of plans to find work, maybe at one of the warehouses along the river, and promised to visit soon. Evelyn clung to those words, replaying them in her mind during the long nights when sleep evaded her. Howard, ever the stoic provider, reassured her that boys like Charles needed space to heal. But as the weeks turned to months, the calls stopped. Christmas came and went without a card or a knock at the door. By spring 1975, worry had etched deep lines into Evelyn's face. She drove to the halfway house, only to learn that Charles had left abruptly, his bed empty for months. No one knew where he had gone, perhaps back to the streets, chasing the highs that had ensnared him, or maybe further afield, drawn by whispers of opportunity across the state line. The family searched in the ways they could. Howard knocked on doors in the seedier parts of Memphis, flashing a faded photo of Charles, smiling, untroubled, the picture from his high school graduation. Evelyn posted flyers in laundromats and diners, her hands trembling as she taped them up, the paper curling in the damp air. They filed a missing persons report with the Memphis police, but the officers were overworked, their desks piled with files from a city gripped by rising crime. "He'll turn up," one detective said kindly, but the words rang hollow. As 1975 faded into 1976, the searches grew less frequent, the hope dimmer. Life pressed on. Howard's shifts at the mill lengthened. Evelyn took an extra sewing to make ends meet, and Charles's siblings, now teenagers themselves, whispered about their brother in hushed tones, wondering if he was out there, alive and ashamed, or lost forever. Across the Mississippi River, in the flat, fertile lands of eastern Arkansas, the year 1977 dawned cold and unforgiving. Lee County was a place of endless fields, where cotton plants stretched like white-capped waves under the relentless sun, and the soil held the weight of history. Sharecroppers' toil, floods that reshaped the land, and quiet communities bound by church suppers and Friday night football. Marianna, the county seat, was a small town of brick storefronts and sagging porches, where everyone knew their neighbor's business but kept it close to the chest. U.S. Highway 79 cut through like a vein, carrying travelers from Memphis to Little Rock, its asphalt humming with the occasional rumble of trucks hauling goods to market. On January 13, 1977, a farmer named Elias Thornton was plowing his field a few miles west of Marianna, the early morning frost still clinging to the furrows. The air bit sharp, carrying the earthy scent of turned soil and distant wood smoke from farmhouses. Elias, a man in his late 50s with weathered skin and a lifetime of dawn-to-dusk labor behind him, guided his old John Deere tractor along the rows, the engine's growl the only sound breaking the rural silence. As he reached the edge of the field, near where the highway's shoulder met the untamed grass, the plow hit something unyielding. The tractor shuddered, and Elias killed the engine, hopping down with a muttered curse. He expected a rock or a stump, relics from the land's stubborn past. But what he uncovered chilled him deeper than the winter wind. Kicking away the dirt, Elias revealed bones, human bones scattered and bleached by exposure. A skull stared up at him, empty sockets accusatory in the pale light, fragments of ribcage and limbs tangled in the roots of wild weeds. His heart pounded as he backed away, the metallic tang of fear in his mouth. This wasn't an animal. No, this was a person, left to the elements like discarded refuse. Elias stumbled to his truck, hands shaking as he radioed the sheriff's office. Within hours, the field transformed from quiet farmland to a crime scene. Deputies cordoned off the area with yellow tape that fluttered like ghosts in the breeze, their boots sinking into the soft earth as they combed the ground. The Arkansas State Police were called in, their investigators arriving in unmarked cars, faces grim under wide-brimmed hats. The remains were partial, skeletal, with no flesh or clothing to offer clues. They belonged to a male, estimated between 16 and 30 years old, dead for anywhere from 6 months to 5 years. The bones showed no obvious signs of trauma, no bullet holes, no fractures from a violent end, but the cause and manner of death eluded the experts. The Arkansas State Crime Laboratory's medical examiner's office took possession, transporting the fragile collection to Little Rock in sealed boxes. There, under fluorescent lights, in a sterile room smelling of formaldehyde, pathologists pieced together what they could. Dental records were checked against missing persons in the area. Fingerprints attempted, though the elements had worn them away. Nothing matched. No wallet, no jewelry, no identifiers. The man became a John Doe, Lee County John Doe, filed away in dusty cabinets, his story reduced to a case number, 77. Word spread through Mariana like wildfire. At the local diner, folks gathered over coffee and biscuits, speculating in low voices. Hitchhiker, maybe, one farmer said, stirring sugar into his cup, or someone running from the law. Elias Thornton couldn't shake the image of those bones. He lay awake nights, wondering about the life that had ended in his field. Who was this stranger, dumped unceremoniously like trash? The community mourned in its quiet way. A prayer at the next church service, a newspaper article in the Weekly Gazette that faded into obscurity. But for the investigators, the case gnawed at them. Detective Harlan Brooks, a veteran with the Arkansas State Police, led the initial probe. He canvassed truck stops along Highway 79, interviewed transients in Memphis flophouses, even followed leads to Chicago where rumors of a runaway matched the description. Each dead end deepened the frustration, the file growing thicker with unanswered questions. Years blurred into decades. The 1980s brought Reagan's America, with its economic booms and busts rippling through rural Arkansas. Lee County's fields were still planted and harvested, but the world changed. Televisions flickered with color, computers hummed in police stations. The John Doe file was dusted off periodically, cross-referenced with national databases when they emerged. In 2009, the case was entered into the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, NAMUS, a federal repository meant to connect dots across states. Harlan Brooks retired in 1985, passing the torch to younger detectives, but the mystery lingered like fog over the Delta. Families in Memphis and beyond continued their private vigils. Evelyn Wallace, now in her 60s, kept Charles's room untouched, a shrine of faded posters and pressed wildflowers. She attended support groups for families of the missing, her voice steady as she shared his story, clinging to the belief that one day answers would come. By the 2010s, technology began to shift the landscape of cold cases. DNA analysis, once a novelty, became a powerhouse, unraveling mysteries that had stumped generations. In March 2024, the Arkansas State Police Cold Case Unit, a specialized team formed to tackle these ghosts, turned their eyes to Lee County John Doe. Led by Colonel Mike Hagar, a no-nonsense officer with a reputation for persistence, the unit pulled the original evidence from storage, those brittle bones, carefully preserved in acid-free boxes. The air in the evidence room was musty, thick with the weight of time. "This one's been waiting long enough," Hagar said to his team, his voice echoing off metal shelves. They partnered with the Arkansas State Crime Laboratory once more, extracting what DNA they could from the skeletal remains. The samples were minute, degraded by years of exposure, but hope lay in a Texas lab called Othram, pioneers in forensic genetic genealogy. Othram wasn't your standard crime lab. It was a beacon of innovation, using cutting-edge techniques to build family trees from scraps of genetic code. The bones were shipped to the Woodlands, Texas, where scientists in white coats worked under hoods that hummed softly, sequencing DNA that told stories of ancestry and loss. Months passed, tense, anticipatory. In June 2025, a report arrived like a thunderclap. The remains tentatively matched Charles Howard Wallace, a missing man from Memphis. The genealogy traced two possible relatives in Tennessee, branches on a family tree long overgrown. Hagar's team moved swiftly. Detectives drove to Tennessee, knocking on doors in quiet suburbs where the Wallaces had settled into the rhythm of aging. Evelyn, now in her 80s, frail but sharp-eyed, met them on her porch, the same one where she'd last waved goodbye to Charles. When they explained the DNA link, her hand flew to her mouth, tears carving paths down weathered cheeks. "My boy," she whispered, the word carrying 50 years of ache. A relative provided a DNA sample, a simple swab from the cheek, unassuming yet profound. It was mailed back to Othram, and on September 2nd, 2025, confirmation came. The bones were Charles's. He would have been 21 when he died, his life cut short in the prime of youth. The news rippled through the family like a stone in still water. Howard, who had passed a decade earlier, would have nodded solemnly, his faith vindicated. Siblings gathered, sharing memories of Charles's laughter, his gentle way with animals, the dreams he'd once voiced of becoming a mechanic. For Evelyn, closure was bittersweet, a son's return, but in fragments unearthed from foreign soil. "I always knew he didn't leave us on purpose," she told a local reporter, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. The identification brought long overdue answers, but questions lingered. What had drawn Charles from the halfway house into the unknown? Had he hitched a ride across the river, seeking solace in Arkansas's anonymity? The circumstances of his death remained shrouded, no trauma evident, but the isolation of the field suggested foul play or accident, perhaps an overdose gone wrong in a desperate flight. Back in Lee County, Elias Thornton's son now farmed the land, but the story of the bones had become local legend, passed down like folklore. When the identification hit the papers, Mariana buzzed anew. At the same diner, decades on, patrons pondered the stranger who had rested in their earth. Detective Brooks, long retired, clipped the article from his newspaper, a quiet satisfaction in knowing justice, or at least truth, had prevailed. Colonel Hagar addressed the press on September 5, 2025, standing before a podium in Little Rock, the state seal gleaming behind him. "This case shows our commitment," he said, his words measured. "No mystery is forgotten." The collaboration with Othram and the crime lab highlighted a new era, where science bridged the chasm of time. Yet, the human heart of the story beat in the quiet moments. Evelyn placed a small marker near her garden, a simple stone engraved with Charles's name and dates. Born 1955, missing since 1974, identified 2025. She spoke to him there, in the rustle of leaves, imagining the man he might have become. The suspense of those lost years, the emotional weight of unanswered grief, had found resolution, but the narrative of Charles Howard Wallace was one of endurance. The family's unyielding love, the investigator's dogged pursuit, the land that held his secrets until it could hold them no longer. In the end, it was a tale of connection reclaimed from oblivion, a reminder that even in death, stories seek their ending. Story 7. The night air in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, has a certain weight to it, a humid thickness that clings to the skin and carries the scent of magnolia and decay. It's a city of vibrant life, of jazz and Creole cooking, a place where history breathes from the antebellum architecture. But beneath the veneer of southern charm, a darkness was taking root, a shadow that stretched its fingers across the city for a decade, leaving a trail of terror and unanswered questions. This is the story of that shadow, of the man who walked among the living while preying on the vulnerable, a man named Sean Vincent Gillis. The story does not begin with a bang, but with a quiet disappearance. In 1994, and Brian, an 82-year-old woman, vanished from her retirement home. There was no sign of a struggle, no obvious clues left behind. She was simply gone. Her case, initially a perplexing mystery, would later become the first chilling chapter in a saga of unimaginable violence. For years, her fate remained unknown, a cold case filed away in the archives of the Baton Rouge Police Department. The city moved on, its residents unaware that a predator was in their midst, honing his gruesome craft. Life in Baton Rouge continued its rhythmic pace. The LSU Tigers played to roaring crowds, the Mississippi River flowed languidly by, and the people of the city went about their daily lives. But every so often, the rhythm would be broken. A woman would go missing. A body would be found. Each time, the circumstances were different enough to prevent a clear pattern from emerging, yet similar enough to whisper of a single, malevolent force at work. The victims were varied, a cross-section of the city's female population. Catherine Hall, a 29-year-old, was found strangled in 1999. Hardy Schmidt, a 52-year-old, met the same fate a year later. Then came Joyce Williams, 36, and Lillian Robinson, 52. With each new victim, fear began to weave its way into the fabric of the community. Women became more cautious, locking their doors a little tighter, glancing over their shoulders as they walked to their cars. The police, for their part, were grappling with a series of seemingly disconnected homicides. The methods of killing were brutal and personal, strangulation, stabbing, but the victims were of different ages, races, and backgrounds. There was no obvious link, no thread to pull that might unravel the mystery. The investigation was a frustrating and painstaking process. Detectives worked tirelessly, chasing down leads that went nowhere, interviewing potential witnesses who had seen nothing. The killer was a ghost, leaving behind him a wake of grief and a frustrating lack of evidence. DNA was collected at the scenes, a silent testament to the killer's presence, but in the days before widespread DNA databases, it was of little immediate use. The genetic material was a key, but there was no lock for it to open. While the police hunted for a phantom, Sean Vincent Gillis lived a life of quiet anonymity. To his neighbors and co-workers, he was an ordinary man. He held down a job, had relationships, and moved through the world with an unsettling normalcy. There was nothing about his outward demeanor to suggest the monstrous darkness that lurked within. He was a master of disguise, not through costume or affectation, but through the sheer banality of his existence. He was the man you might see at the grocery store, the driver in the car next to you at a red light, the neighbor you'd nod to as you collected your mail. This, perhaps, is the most terrifying aspect of the story. The monster was not a caricature of evil, but a man who looked just like everyone else. Inside his home, however, a different reality was taking shape. Gillis was a collector of trophies, macabre mementos of his crimes. He kept personal items belonging to his victims, a driver's license, a photograph, a piece of jewelry. These were not just souvenirs, they were extensions of his power, tangible proof of his dominion over the lives he had taken. He would photograph his victims, not as a record of their death, but as a way to relive the act, to savor the moment of ultimate control. His home was a private museum of horror, a gallery of his depravity, hidden behind a facade of suburban normalcy. The turning point in the investigation came not from a brilliant piece of detective work or a lucky break, but from a gradual accumulation of evidence, a slow and steady tightening of the net. The key, as it so often is in modern criminal investigations, was DNA. As technology advanced, The DNA samples collected from the various crime scenes were entered into a national database. The hope was that a match would eventually be found, linking the disparate cases to a single individual. In early 2004, that hope was realized. The DNA from the murder of Donna Bennett Johnston, a 43-year-old woman found dead in February of that year, was linked to the DNA found at the scenes of several other unsolved homicides in the Baton Rouge area. The ghost now had a genetic fingerprint. The seemingly random killings were the work of a single serial killer. The news sent a fresh wave of terror through the city, but for the investigators, it was a breakthrough. They were no longer hunting multiple assailants. They were hunting one man. The task force assigned to the case redoubled its efforts. They re-examined old evidence, re-interviewed witnesses, and began to look for connections between the victims that they might have previously missed. The geographical locations of the bodies, the timelines of the disappearances, the specific methods of the killings. Every detail was scrutinized in the search for a pattern. Meanwhile, Gillis continued to walk free, perhaps emboldened by his success in evading capture for so long. But his luck was about to run out. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place in a way that no one could have predicted. It wasn't a witness or a confidential informant that led the police to Gillis's door, but the killer himself. In a bizarre and brazen act, Gillis made a series of calls to the police, taunting them with details of his crimes. He seemed to be playing a game, a cat-and-mouse chase with the very people who were hunting him. It was a fatal miscalculation. The calls, while intended to mock and mislead, provided the police with a crucial piece of information: the killer's voice. The investigation now had a new focus: to identify the man behind the voice on the phone. They began to cross-reference the DNA evidence with other databases, searching for a familial match that might lead them to their suspect. The painstaking work paid off. A partial match was found, pointing them in the direction of a family with the surname Gillis. The net was closing in. Investigators began to surveil Sean Vincent Gillis, a man who fit the general profile they had developed of the killer. He was in the right age range, lived in the area, and had a history of minor offenses. They needed a sample of his DNA to confirm their suspicions, and they got it from a discarded cigarette. The test results were conclusive. The DNA from the cigarette was a perfect match to the DNA found at the crime scenes. The ghost had a name. On April 29, 2004, a team of officers descended on Gillis's home. The arrest was quiet, almost anticlimactic. The man who had terrorized Baton Rouge for a decade surrendered without a fight. The reign of the shadow was over. The search of Gillis's home was a journey into the heart of darkness. The trophies, the photographs, the personal effects of his victims. It was all there, a chilling testament to the depth of his depravity. For the investigators, it was a sickening and surreal experience, a confrontation with the tangible evidence of the evil they had been hunting. With Gillis in custody, the full scope of his crimes began to emerge. He confessed to 8 murders, his voice calm and matter-of-fact as he recounted the gruesome details. He spoke of his victims with a chilling detachment, as if they were not people, but objects for his gratification. He led investigators to the remains of some of his victims, their bodies discarded in remote, desolate locations. The trial of Sean Vincent Gillis was a somber and emotionally charged affair. The courtroom was filled with the families of the victims, their faces etched with a grief that was almost unbearable to witness. They listened as the prosecution laid out the case against Gillis, presenting the overwhelming DNA evidence, the chilling confessions, and the macabre collection of trophies found in his home. The defense, faced with a mountain of irrefutable evidence, had little to offer. They attempted to argue that Gillis was mentally ill, that he was not in control of his actions. But the prosecution painted a different picture, that of a cunning and methodical killer who knew exactly what he was doing. They argued that his careful planning, his efforts to avoid detection, and his collection of souvenirs were all signs of a man who was not insane, but evil. The jury agreed. Sean Vincent Gillis was found guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Donna Bennett Johnston. The penalty phase of the trial was a formality. The jury, having heard the horrific details of his crimes, sentenced him to death. In a separate trial, he was convicted of the murder of Catherine Hall and received a life sentence. The verdict brought a sense of closure to the families of the victims, but it could not erase the pain of their loss. The wounds were too deep, the scars too permanent. The city of Baton Rouge, too, was left to grapple with the legacy of Sean Vincent Gillis. The case had exposed a darkness that many had never imagined, a reminder that evil can lurk in the most ordinary of places, behind the most unassuming of faces. The story of Sean Vincent Gillis is a chilling exploration of the nature of evil. It is a story of a man who lived a double life, a man who was both predator and neighbor, monster and citizen. It is a story of the victims whose lives were cut short by a senseless act of violence, and of the families who were left to pick up the pieces. And it is a story of the tireless efforts of law enforcement, who, through a combination of old-fashioned detective work and modern technology, brought a killer to justice. The humid night air of Baton Rouge still carries the scent of magnolia and decay, but for those who remember the reign of the shadow, there is another scent as well, the faint, lingering odor of fear. The story of Sean Vincent Gillis is a permanent part of the city's history, a dark chapter in its otherwise vibrant narrative, a reminder of the time when a monster walked among them. And though the monster is now caged, the memory of his crimes, and of the lives he so cruelly extinguished, will forever haunt the city on the Mississippi. Story 8. The autumn of 1992 should have been a season of contentment for Sarah Tokars. At 39 years old, she lived in a beautiful home in Marietta, Georgia, in the comfortable embrace of Cobb County's affluent suburbs. She had 2 young sons, Ricky, age 6, and Mike, age 4, who filled her days with laughter and the chaotic joy that only small children can bring. To the casual observer, Sarah's life appeared to be everything a woman could want: a successful husband, a lovely home, financial security, and the precious gift of motherhood. But beneath this veneer of domestic perfection, Sarah Tokars was living in a nightmare that grew darker with each passing day. Her husband, Frederick William Tokars, known to everyone as Fred, was a respected figure in Atlanta's legal community. He had served as an Atlanta prosecutor and a traffic court judge before establishing his own law practice. With his accounting expertise and knowledge of offshore banking, Fred presented himself as a sophisticated attorney who understood the intricacies of finance and law. He moved through Atlanta's professional circles with confidence, his mild-mannered demeanor earning him trust and respect. But Fred Tokars was not the man he appeared to be. Behind closed doors, he was what prosecutors would later describe as a wolf in sheep's clothing, a man whose veneer of respectability concealed a sordid underworld existence. Fred Tokars had built a lucrative side business that had nothing to do with legitimate legal work. He used his expertise in accounting and offshore banking to launder millions of dollars in drug money for violent drugs traffickers with connections stretching from Detroit to Los Angeles to Miami. The operation was sophisticated and deliberate. Fred had established offshore bank accounts in the Bahamas and had even obtained a Class B banking license from Montserrat. He worked with a partner, Eddie Lawrence, a construction businessman who became both his client and his accomplice. Together, they used Lawrence's construction business as a front, incorporating several shell companies designed to move dirty money through the financial system without leaving a paper trail. Fred had boasted to associates that he wasn't worried about the Internal Revenue Service because he intended to leave no trace of his crimes. For years, Sarah remained oblivious to her husband's criminal enterprises. She focused on raising their boys, managing their household, and maintaining the appearance of normalcy that Fred insisted upon. But gradually, cracks began to appear in the facade. Sarah started to notice things that didn't add up, financial irregularities that couldn't be explained away with Fred's smooth talk and authoritative demeanor. At some point in 1992, Sarah made a discovery that would seal her fate. She found documents that revealed the truth about Fred's offshore bank accounts and his money laundering operations. The woman who had once loved and trusted her husband now saw him clearly for what he was: Sarah was terrified, not just of Fred's criminal activities, but of Fred himself. She confided in her sister, Christine Ambrusco, telling her that she wanted a divorce, but was deeply concerned that Fred would take the children away from her. According to Christine, Sarah was very scared and intimidated by her husband. Sarah made copies of Fred's incriminating financial documents and gave them to her cousin, Mary Rose Taylor, asking her to keep them safe. She told Christine to give the documents to police if anything happened to her, a chilling instruction that revealed just how grave she believed her situation to be. But Sarah's fear went beyond the financial crimes. There were signs that Fred's behavior toward her had become violent. One attorney who knew the couple recalled receiving a phone call from Sarah declining an invitation to a party. "I feel so bad that we're not able to come to your party," Sarah had told him quietly. "I'm not well." When the attorney expressed concern, Sarah's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "I can't come because I have bruises on my left arm and side where Fred beat me." The revelation hung in the air like a death knell, but Sarah seemed trapped, unable to escape the man who controlled every aspect of her life. By the fall of 1992, federal investigators had begun circling Fred Tokars. His money laundering operation had come to their attention, and the walls were slowly closing in. Fred knew this, and he also knew that Sarah had become as a ticking time bomb. She possessed knowledge that could destroy him, evidence that could send him to prison for decades. In Fred's cold calculation, Sarah had transformed from his wife into a liability that needed to be eliminated. Fred approached Eddie Lawrence with a proposition that was as shocking as it was direct. Fred wanted Eddie to find someone to kill Sarah. Eddie initially tried to talk Fred out of it, suggesting that divorce would be a simpler solution. But Fred's response was chilling in its finality. "That's not gonna do." Eddie Lawrence, already deeply entangled in Fred's criminal enterprise and facing his own legal troubles for writing fraudulent checks, felt he had no choice but to comply. He began searching for a hit man, asking around in Atlanta's criminal underworld until he found Curtis Rower, a crack-addicted drifter who was desperate enough to kill a stranger for money. The plan was set for the Thanksgiving weekend of 1992. Fred had arranged for Sarah and the boys to travel to Florida for the holiday, a trip that would provide him with an alibi while giving Lawrence and Rower time to prepare. On the morning Sarah was scheduled to leave, Fred called Eddie Lawrence with instructions about a supposedly broken water heater at the house, though Lawrence declined the request. The real purpose of the call was to coordinate the timing of the murder. That afternoon, while Sarah and the boys were away enjoying what should have been a peaceful family holiday, Curtis Rower was preparing to take her life. The evening of November 29, 1992, was cool and dark as Sarah Tokars drove her white Toyota 4Runner along the familiar roads of Cobb County. She had just returned from Florida with Ricky and Mike, both boys tired from the long drive but happy to be home. Sarah had even bought a Christmas tree during the trip, promising the children that they would decorate it together before the month ended. As she pulled into the driveway of their home around 7 o'clock that evening, Sarah had no way of knowing that Curtis Rower had been waiting inside the house for at least an hour. Eddie Lawrence had dropped Rower off at the Tokars' residence equipped with a sawed-off shotgun and explicit instructions. Kill a white female, approximately 40 years old. Lawrence then drove to a neighboring subdivision to wait, ready to pick up Rower after the deed was done. When Sarah opened the front door with her sons in tow, she found herself face to face with a stranger pointing a gun directly at her. The family dog, Jake, began barking frantically. Rower kicked the animal aside and forced Sarah and Ricky back toward the car. Mike, the youngest, was already half asleep, barely comprehending the nightmare unfolding around him. Rower climbed into the back seat behind Sarah, positioning himself next to the drowsy 4-year-old Mike. He pressed the gun to Sarah's head and ordered her to drive. Mike would later recall, with a clarity that defied his tender age, the terror of that moment, watching a stranger hold a weapon to his mother's head. Sarah, her voice trembling but steady, pleaded with her killer, "Just don't hurt me and my kids." It was a mother's desperate prayer, the only words she could summon in the face of incomprehensible violence. Rower forced her to drive away from the house, away from safety, toward a destination that would become her final resting place. After driving approximately half a mile down the dark road, the car pulled over. Sarah Tokar's shoot from a distance of approximately 1 foot or less. There was execution that took place in that car while her 2 small sons sat mere inches away, trapped in a moment of horror that would haunt them forever. The crack of the shotgun shattered the night. In the front passenger seat, 6-year-old Ricky Tokars watched his mother slump over the steering wheel, blood pouring from the catastrophic wound in her head. While most children his age would have been paralyzed by shock and terror, Ricky's mind snapped into a clarity born of pure survival instinct. He leaned across his mother's body and turned off the car's ignition. The killer fled into the darkness, running toward Eddie Lawrence's waiting vehicle. Ricky turned to his younger brother Mike and told him they had to go for help. Mike, looking at his mother's lifeless form, sensed something his brother couldn't yet articulate. Their mother was already gone. The 2 boys tumbled out of the blood-soaked vehicle and ran through the darkness. They pushed through bushes thick with thorns that tore at their skin, their own blood mixing with their mother's blood that still stained their clothes. They ran approximately 100 yards until they reached a nearby house, where they pounded on the door, 2 small boys covered in blood, their innocence shattered forever. The homeowners called 911, and within minutes, Cobb County Sheriff's deputies arrived at the scene. What officers found that night was a tableau of unimaginable brutality. Sarah Tokars sat slumped in the driver's seat of her 4Runner, her blood and fragments of her skull and brain splattered throughout the interior of the vehicle. There was no shell casing, no discarded items, just the overwhelming evidence of a violent death. In those days before widespread DNA testing, investigators had to rely primarily on fingerprints and witness testimony. The crime scene offered few immediate answers, but it raised troubling questions. Was this a random robbery gone wrong? An attempted assault that ended in murder? Or was there something more sinister at play? Fred Tokars, who had been visiting Wilbert Humphreys, a money launderer sitting in a Montgomery, Alabama jail, on the Sunday after Thanksgiving, rushed back to Georgia when he learned of Sarah's death. The timing of that jail visit would later strike investigators as suspicious. Tokars had driven all the way to Montgomery to have Humphreys sign some papers, a meeting that lasted only about 10 minutes and seemed strangely urgent. When Fred arrived at the hospital, he was informed that his wife was dead and his sons were safe. To those who watched him, Fred's grief seemed performative, lacking the raw anguish one would expect from a man who had just lost his wife. The investigation into Sarah's murder initially floundered. Without physical evidence or clear suspects, detectives had little to pursue. But Curtis Rower, high on crack cocaine in the days following the murder, couldn't keep his mouth shut. He bragged carelessly to several people that he had killed a woman, his drug-addled tongue wagging in strip clubs and crack houses across Atlanta. A parade of prostitutes, drug addicts, and other unsavory characters began coming forward with information, and eventually, the trail led directly to Rower. When police arrested Curtis Rower and confronted him with the evidence, he confessed to shooting Sarah Tokars. But Rower insisted he wasn't the mastermind behind the murder. He named the man who had paid him $5,000 to kill a woman he'd never met, Eddie Lawrence. Lawrence was arrested the same day, but initially, he refused to cooperate with investigators. Police, however, weren't convinced they had the full story. They dug deeper and discovered the connection between Eddie Lawrence and Fred Tokars, learning about their business partnerships and the legal representation Fred had provided to Eddie. For 8 long months after Sarah's murder, the investigation stalled as prosecutors worked to build their case. Then, in July 1993, Eddie Lawrence finally broke. Facing the prospect of spending the rest of his life in prison, he confessed the full truth. Fred Tokars had hired him to kill Sarah because she knew too much about his criminal activities. Lawrence couldn't bring himself to pull the trigger, so he hired Curtis Rower to do the killing for him. But it was Fred Tokars, the mild-mannered lawyer and former prosecutor, who had orchestrated the entire plot. On the Monday following Sarah's murder, while the investigation was still in its infancy, Sarah's cousin Mary Rose Taylor had contacted Sarah's sister Christine with a request. She asked Christine to find the documents that Sarah had given to Mary Rose for safekeeping. Christine went to her house, located the papers, made copies, and delivered them to police. The documents revealed Fred Tokars's offshore bank accounts in the Bahamas and his licensed bank in Montserrat, the financial architecture of his money laundering empire. Sarah, knowing her husband's capacity for violence, had left behind a roadmap that would lead investigators straight to his crimes. Fred Tokars was first tried in federal court on racketeering charges related to his money laundering operation. The trial, moved to Birmingham, Alabama due to extensive pretrial publicity, laid bare the full scope of Fred's criminal enterprise. Prosecutors presented evidence that Tokars had laundered millions of dollars for violent drug traffickers, using his legal expertise and financial knowledge to conceal the origins of dirty money. Eddie Lawrence testified in detail about Fred's involvement in Sarah's murder, describing how Fred had contacted him to find a hitman and how Fred had refused to consider divorce as an alternative. The jury deliberated and found Fred Tokars guilty on multiple counts, sentencing him to 4 concurrent life sentences. But federal prosecutors and Sarah's family wanted more than convictions on financial crimes. They wanted Fred Tokars to face murder charges and the possibility of the death penalty. In early 1997, Fred Tokars stood trial in state court in Lafayette, Georgia, charged with the murder of his wife. The trial was moved between Atlanta and Chattanooga, Tennessee, again due to massive media coverage. This time, Fred Tokars wasn't just fighting for his freedom, he was fighting for his life. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. They called Eddie Lawrence to the stand, where he repeated his testimony about Fred's role in hiring him to arrange Sarah's murder. Curtis Rower testified about the actual killing, providing gruesome details about the night he waited in the Tokars' home and forced Sarah to drive to her death. Prosecutors presented the financial documents that Sarah had hidden away, showing the jury the evidence of Fred's criminal empire and his motive for silencing his wife. They argued that Sarah had discovered her husband's money laundering operation at precisely the moment when he was under federal investigation, making her an existential threat to his freedom. Fred Tokars' defense team, led by legendary attorney Bobby Lee Cook, argued that Eddie Lawrence and Curtis Rower were unreliable witnesses whose testimony couldn't be trusted. They suggested that Lawrence had his own reasons for wanting Sarah dead, and that he was pointing the finger at Fred to save himself. But the jury saw through the defense strategy. After deliberating for approximately 10 hours spread over 2 days, they returned on March 8, 1997 with a verdict, guilty of murder with malice. Prosecutors, confident they had finally secured a death sentence for Fred Tokars, prepared for the penalty phase with grim determination. But on March 12th, just 4 days after the guilty verdict, the same jury that had convicted him decided to spare his life. Instead of the electric chair, Fred Tokars received another life sentence, this one to run consecutively with his federal sentences. He would spend the rest of his days in prison, but he would not face execution. Curtis Rower, the man who actually pulled the trigger, was convicted of Sarah's murder and sentenced to life in prison. Eddie Lawrence, who had cooperated with prosecutors and provided crucial testimony against Fred Tokars, plea bargained his way to a 12-and-a-half-year federal prison term. The 3 men, Fred Tokars, Eddie Lawrence, and Curtis Rower, each bore responsibility for Sarah's death, though their levels of culpability and their sentences varied widely. For Sarah's 2 sons, Ricky and Mike, the aftermath of their mother's murder was a journey through trauma that would define their entire lives. Mike, who was only 4 years old when he watched his mother die, would later recall the events of that night with an unsettling clarity. He remembered the stranger climbing into their car, the terror in his mother's voice, the sound of the gunshot, and the desperate run through thorny bushes toward help. The next morning, at their uncle's house, the 2 boys ate waffles and kept repeating what they had witnessed, trying to process the unprocessable. Mike never spoke to his father again after learning that Fred had orchestrated their mother's murder. At that point, he was no longer a good guy in my eyes. Mike would later say with the measured tone of someone who has learned to live with unspeakable pain. The boys were raised by Sarah's family, loved and protected by the same people who had tried desperately to save Sarah from the fate that ultimately claimed her. Fred Tokars died in 2018 while serving his life sentences, never having expressed genuine remorse for the murder he orchestrated or the children he traumatized. To his last breath, he maintained elements of his innocence, though the overwhelming evidence and the testimony of his co-conspirators painted an undeniable picture of his guilt. Sarah Tokars was 39 years old when she died, a mother who begged for her children's safety in her final moments, a woman who had the courage to stand up to a dangerous man even when she knew the risks. Her legacy lives on not just in the legal precedents set by her case, but in the two sons who survived that terrible night and grew into men who understand both the depths of human evil and the power of resilience. Ricky, who at 6 years old had the presence of mind to turn off the car's ignition and lead his younger brother to safety, and Mike, who carries the memories of that night with a quiet strength, are Sarah's greatest testimony. They are the proof that even in the darkest moments, when violence shatters everything good and pure, the human spirit can endure, can heal, and can honor the memory of a mother who died trying to protect them.